Sometimes when we read the Bible, it's hard to make a connection to our lives. Sometimes when we read the Bible, it's hard to find the meaning that's there. But sometimes when we read the Bible, we find a great story. And the connections come easily, and the meanings are everywhere. For me, this is one of those kinds of stories. Now, it's not a story you might recognize from your life at first. Elijah is in trouble, big trouble. And it stemmed from what seemed to be a great triumph. He had just come from this thrilling encounter where he'd taken on 450 prophets of Baal and was so splendidly victorious that he thought he had made it crystal clear who was the real God and who was really in charge. But you see, the queen had been a champion for Baal, so she was not pleased with any of it. And she vowed that she would take Elijah's life. This seemed to throw a curve in Elijah's understanding of who was actually in charge. So, seeing the writing on the wall, Elijah ran, and ran, and ran. So, up to this point, I'm guessing most of us would probably not relate. The queen's not coming after us, I don't think. But perhaps we can relate to that feeling of wanting or needing to run away, or wanting to run away from the chaos, or feeling disappointed that what we thought might happen didn't turn out the way we'd hoped after all, or feeling underappreciated after all the energy we've put in. Or perhaps we might connect with the feeling expressed by Elijah when he collapses under the tree, feeling weary and worn out and abandoned by God. We might have wondered why God was being so silent at times. Perhaps we might identify with the desire to just give up. Well, God's response in the story to all of these feelings is to give Elijah a dream. And in the dream, an angel or a voice or some deep wisdom comes and says, "Get up, eat, drink, or it will be too much for you." I'm struck by this wisdom for times of hopelessness. When we are feeling sorry for ourselves, God does two things in that dream. Well, does one thing and doesn't do another. What God doesn't do is make room for wallowing in despair. Turns out God doesn't really have a lot of patience for Elijah's melodrama in this moment. And yet God is full of care for Elijah. You need to have some food. You need to drink. You need to look after yourself so that you can get through this. Yes, Elijah, it's taking a lot of energy. I know that. All you've got, maybe. But you can make it. You can. Look after yourself and you can do it. I wonder if this is what God offers to all of us in the midst of tough or trying times. I know that we would like it to be easier. And we can all get caught at times feeling sorry for ourselves, wishing our problem of the moment would just go away. But God doesn't really indulge us in that sort of thinking. But God does ask us to take care. Take care so that we can bring all that we are to the task, whatever it is, so that we too can make it through. So in the story, Elijah does get up and keep going. But instead of dealing with his problem, he keeps going away, running away. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs, until he drops. And he sleeps, and what do you know? Another dream. And in this dream, God says to Elijah, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Well, Elijah thinks this is the most ridiculous question and responds with kind of a self-righteous whine. I can imagine this tone in my head. I've heard it in my head a lot of times. I've been working so hard and trying to do the right thing, and those people have totally abandoned you, and I'm the only one left who's faithful and doing anything, and I'm all alone and I'm doomed. You might as well kill me now. But he's misunderstood the question. Lawrence Ferris suggests that God is trying with Elijah to get at the fact that he can't fulfill God's purposes if he's not where God needs him to be. So what are you doing here, Elijah? Well, to teach Elijah that he's looking for the wrong things in the wrong places, God invites Elijah out on the mountain. And then there was a great wind. But God was not in the wind. And there came an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. There came a fire. But God was not in the fire. It's interesting that throughout the course of human history, people have looked to God to do great and powerful things. They've looked to blame or thank God for huge natural phenomena or disaster. And time again, our stories tell us that God's power is found in small things. Yeast, seeds, a baby born in a stable, and in this case, silence, or a whisper, or whatever it was that Elijah actually experienced on that mountain. In each of our lives, we know the value of small. And yet somehow, we continually need to be convinced of its value as we try to look instead for inspiration in the defeating of opposing prophets, or as we call them today, influencers with millions of followers, or celebrities, or politicians. We need to remind ourselves in these times, as we look out at the news, where this week we learned about monsoon rains in Southern California that caused 50,000 lightning strikes and wildfires everywhere. In Afghanistan this week, there was a 6.1 magnitude earthquake. It has devastated homes and villages and livelihoods, and the death count is over 1,000. We look at events in the news that feel like they are quaking the earth in a social or economic level. You can tell probably by my face, I was burned by the wind yesterday out in the wind that blows on the prairies. I think there were a couple of tornado sightings. We look for God in power. But God is not, we are told, in that kind of power, in that kind of wind or fire or earthquake. But when we look, we trust that there are many small whispering acts that are showing the presence of God, bringing healing to suffering people among all of those circumstances. You've seen them. You've been them. Think about Mitchell's initiative with the canna lilies, that with your support raised $3,225 for exactly those kinds of kindnesses, in this case for people in the Ukraine. We live in a noisy world, and in the midst of our troubles, our trials, our tribulations, our discouragement, when we have all but given up and would just as soon be swallowed up, we have this tendency to look for God in all the wrong places. And in a quiet moment that may follow the futile search, we will at last find God in the silence, in the void, in the back corners. And then we will finally realize that God was there all along. I don't know if you're familiar with the Birdman of Alcatraz. His birth name was Robert Stroud. He lived the early part of the 1900s. And at the age of 19, he was sent to prison for killing a man in a barroom brawl. And then he was put in solitary confinement for killing a prison guard. He was a disturbed and unhappy person, doomed to spend the rest of his life without any personal contact, except with a guard once a week when he was allowed to have a shower. But his life was changed one day with a whisper. A small bird perched on the windowsill of his cell. And over time, that bird kept coming back. And then other birds started to come. And Stroud started to pay attention to them and learn a lot about birds. He started to read about them, their care, and the diseases to which they were so susceptible. And eventually he was able to get permission to house some birds in his cell. And he started conducting research. And in 1939, Stroud's Digest on the Diseases of Birds was one of the most comprehensive and authoritative studies ever done on bird diseases and their cures. I think God's whisper always invites us to offer something to the world. It's a word of comfort to remind us we're not alone, but also a word that says, what are you doing here? For as terrible as it may seem, there may still be something to offer the world to make it better, which is usually our last instinct when we're trying to run away and hide. The end of the story, God reminds Elijah that he's not alone after all. And in fact, there are many more like him out there. And to make it so, why doesn't he just go and anoint 3 others? Bring 3 others on board. Not a crowd, not a mob, not a group. Just 3 is enough for now. Small is enough. And so Elijah heads down the mountain. It is a marvelous story. It is a comforting story. It is a challenging story, as faith stories usually are. And so the story is offered to us as a gift for our lives in whatever place we find ourselves. May God's whisper blow through this place and through our hearts this day. Amen.